Okay, so let's start with Kristine's. Kristine's is here. Also, these themes are just meant to help organize the questions. Sometimes I move them around. So Kristine has a question centering around team and stakeholders. So she asked, a dev-heavy startup has asked, I think this is supposed to be Anne, has asked an outside facilitator to lead a design sprint and invite UX product designers to participate. How would you handle this? Well, Kristine, what's the real challenge there?
I think the real challenge is that they're just all developers. They're a startup and there's just all developers, and I have to probe a little bit more to understand why they're asking for that. But it scared me a little bit because I thought like, oh, they want someone to make something pretty, or like they know their product, but I think that they're just maybe looking for someone on the outside to make it, I don't know, to find some like, magic bullet or something.
Yeah. Yep. Well, so sometimes starting in the problem space is a really good idea, especially with a group of engineers. So I'm happy that you're asking this question in the context of framing. So helping them to identify an important problem, one that is probably less obvious to them, because they're probably, if they're engineers, I used to be a software developer, they're probably coming armed to the teeth with ideas and solutions. So, you and I have talked before. So like spending time with each of them to understand what they're using the sprint and any kind of like research or activities leading up to it is for. And if you hear like, we're not sure, it's just like, we've been asked to do this and we think it's a waste of time actually, then probably even indexing even more on doing some framing, because there's probably some misalignment there. There's probably, for you, you'll have a chore to take people out of solution mind and into problem space. And then there'll also be like, of course, super biased and assumptive about their ideas. So my favorite thing to do, which I've shared in past episodes of this, is if you can't get them one-on-one, first idea, get them one-on-one, understand why a sprint, what's going on, what are you excited to like learn about. If it's just to like means to an end to get to the solution, then you probably do want to like pump the brakes on them a little bit. You could do that by a quick round of asking them to sort of like capture what problem they're there to solve, which we can probably get into Taylor's question soon thereafter about this, and just hear them out. So if individually all of these designers, or I'm sorry, all of these engineers and architects are completely misaligned, and there's some way that you could capture that and just show them that it's going to be really difficult to get into solutions if everyone's coming from a different lens like that, and just back them up into thinking about the customer, honestly, that's probably the easiest thing to do, is just to put the customer back in front of them. You could kick off a sprint by leading a couple interviews with their customers. And of course, you would do a great job, Kristine, to ask questions about the challenges that they face, if it's an existing product or a competing product that they're using, and just let the group really ground themselves in the customer. So like, I just wrote a newsletter about this. So shifting them sort of like back up the spectrum from being feature driven, which most engineering groups are, to even getting them to a holistic product experience. And then even better, if you can move them back into the customer space by like putting customer research in front of them, letting them hear directly from the customer, even you interviewing the customer and putting clips like audio clips or snippets of quotes from the customer, all in the sense of, again, grounding them in what the customer actually needs. That might allow them to say, yeah, okay, maybe we should spend a little bit of time getting clear on what we're trying to do here.
Thank you.
Lots of stuff. And I like Taylor's question as a follow-up to that. How do you convince C-suite that framing and a problem isn't a distraction from solutioning or worse, negativity. Taylor and I have been talking about this offline a little bit. What have we been talking about, Taylor? I think what we've been saying is like, yeah, it feels like you're totally spot on. If I get the same sense of we're going backwards when I talk about, well, first, before we get into solutioning and ideation and brainstorming, we're going to talk about the problems and the challenges. So I think one of like the simple things I mentioned that you might want to switch is don't use the word problem, use the word opportunity. That puts a positive spin on it and people get excited about opportunities. They don't tend to get too excited about talking about problems. They consider it like their problem or something they did wrong, or they didn't think about something like they should have, or that the product or the experience is the problem. And of course, since they own that product, they consider it to be their fault. So like, again, back to Kristine's question, shifting them into what's best for the customer and the opportunities to improve that customer experience tend to lend themselves better to being accepted by the team. How else do they think it's negative? Taylor, what else have you heard since we were talking about this a couple of weeks ago?
For a little context here. So the organization where I work has a very like white knuckle culture, as one of my colleagues calls it. It's just kind of like if you stop moving, you die, then move fast to break things, right? And so if someone has a solution at all, it's like rush to ship it, even if it is just for an N of one customer, that is not necessarily relevant to the kind of ideal profile we want to get after. And so kind of asking to take a step back from white knuckling is seen as quite threatening within the organization. So again, like Jay mentioned, Jay's been kind of teaching me how to deal with this. And two things worked really well for me. One, I tried the ICBD exercise that Jay teaches in his facilitation course. And what that did for me is in concerns, I got the CEO and COO to both tell me what the problem was without me having to bring it up myself, which opened the door for me to actually talk about the problem later because they had already told me that it was the case and therefore it was something that we were allowed to address. And then the other thing that worked was this idea of grounding in the customer, but customer trends. And so the white knuckle approach, people tend to think that they are customer centric because they're building for a customer that requested a thing, but like designed by committee and designed by just like every customer request is just not strategic, And so kind of grounding in the most viable customer or the like most requested thing, I guess, has been helpful, but I'm still kind of in the weeds of this.
Nice. Good work. That's hard to do. That's great. ICBD, I think it's now called the All-In, and it was created by Alex Jamieson and Bob Gower, husband and wife. They wrote a book. Called Radical Alignment. So if you're interested in that, it's a great tool for opening up conversations, especially like difficult ones. Good for kickoffs, good for like before doing a team charter. The team charter is kind of solution-y, so that like the alignment piece is more like before we get into solving this and having a charter and a plan of action, let's make sure that we understand who's here and what's important to all of them. Yeah. So, I mean, honestly, Taylor, it just sounds like you listened to them and maybe that's all that they needed somebody to hear them instead of like labeling what they're trying to do as a problem. So jargon definitely sometimes gets in my way as well. And it sounds negative. Cool. Okay.
Jay, I have a ton of questions. So if you need to skip over me, I won't take it personally.
I love all these. Thank you. No, it's much better. Sometimes like people just come to hang out. So I like having some questions. Let's see. It's also going to test how effective I can be at just getting to the point of answering questions. What questions? Let's see. Kristine's next one was, what questions do you ask a client team when you first meet them to determine whether they are good candidates for problem framing? I ask them, well,
or like maybe a better way to say that is like, how do you know when they're good candidates for problem framing? And just for my little backstory in this example, I am thinking of one potential new project. And of course, as an outside facilitator, my role is a little bit different from some people who are in internal product teams, but they came to me asking for like a 5-day sprint. And I was like, whoa, you're not ready. There's not a problem to solve here. So I don't know if that was like
yeah,
the right approach, or like, how do you know when this tool, which is a challenging tool, I've done it with you before, like, how do you know when to use this and not something else?
yeah. So off the cuff, I think I asked them, what do you know? What have you done? What have you learned? I tried it like, right. So what have you learned about this space? It's different depending if it's like new problem space, in which they tend to be a little bit more open-minded, because they're like, no, this is like, this is greenfield thinking. So we're kind of coming in from the ground start. If it's a existing platform or product or service, then they're a little bit more defensive of it. And so like asking them, what have they learned or what are they trying to learn is important. And then I listen for language cues. So if they talk about revenue and improve conversions and better onboarding experiences and things like that, so those are all like internal motivations, then that's where they're at right now. And I'd be like, great, so what's important to the customer, and what's that problem that you're trying to solve? And if they struggle to articulate that, or if different stakeholders communicate different customers, different pain points that they're solving for, then those are cues that it would be well worth spending like a half day just to kind of tease that out about what the problem is that we're there to solve. And then I just give them a little bit of a backstory on why problem framing. So I have a number of like stories and videos and things that I can share with them just to show them that if we were to begin without having a clear and aligned problem, then we're probably going to waste a lot of time, and we're going to be back in this space in a couple of weeks from now or a couple of years from now. So it'd be a good indication. What else do I listen for? So like purely company focused, being feature driven, or like what's important to the product. So fixing the onboarding experience, great, but why is that important to the customer, right? So those are some of the questions that I would ask them. And then the complement to that, what I said before, is great, and what have you learned about that so far? And that's the opening to, have you done any research? Do you have a practice where you talk to your customers? What does that look like? They might say yes, and then they send me like a very biased survey that goes out once a year to like 1,000 people. Right. So like just continuing to dig in, but what I'm trying to understand is, where are they at right now? And what I'm trying to figure out is, what is my starting point? It may be a sprint at like 10%, maybe probably less, 5% of the stuff that people reach out to for me, where they're like, we're ready for a brainstorm and a solution session, like 5% of that is true. And so most of the work that I do pulls them back into articulating the problem and having a vision and doing all that work.
Awesome.
So if you're feeling that, you're not alone. Wow, 30 minutes goes by much faster. Dan, I'm glad you joined. Dan and I were doing some emailing back and forth after he was going through some of the Cynefin in particular in the prioritization and problem framing toolkits. Yeah. Okay. So can you give any tips for running folks through the Cynefin? Yeah. So the Cynefin, if you haven't heard of the Cynefin framework, it's a sense-making model for leaders. So leaders who are trying to solve or like approach a problem space, and they're not sure what space they're actually working within. So Cynefin actually is a Welsh word. It stands for habitat, meaning like trying to figure out what space you're actually in. And there are 4 regions. There's 5 regions. It was invented by Dave Snowden, and he corrected me once because I referred to them as quadrants, and they're not, because there's 5. So they sort of go in a counterclockwise direction from simple problems, complicated, complex, and chaotic. And then in the center, when teams are unsure where they're working is disorder. And so like, if you don't know, Cynefin is great because if you don't know where you are, what kind of the level of complexity of the problem that you're working on, you may bring people and tools and resources and frameworks that don't match for that domain. So if you're working on a simple problem and you bring all of these strategists and architects and engineers that are used to like rapid innovation and prototyping, it may be way over engineered for just something that can be well scripted and just fixed with like something that belongs in a backlog, give it to an engineer or someone, a content strategist, and just have them go to town on it. And then the opposite is true, of course. If you're working in the complex space and you're like, if we put a perfect project plan in place and just get enough sprints in, we'll be able to fix this. But you may spend an inordinate amount of time fixing a complex problem and move the needle very little. And then you might do a quick round of research and have this huge aha moment. And so that's where like the complex space is best solved by like poking around in the dark and building like light and quick paper prototypes and just learning what the problem is itself. So the Cynefin helps you see all of that. It also helps you align with strategic visioning. So if you were commissioned to run a sprint or like work on a project and senior leadership is looking at the team to do like to have like a big moonshot, like big bet kind of stuff, and the team decides to work on things that are like quick wins, then there's misalignment there. So having that conversation by using an activity like the Cynefin helps align the team, helps you figure out what problem space you're in, helps you make sure that you're aligned with senior leadership as well. It also, like Dan, like you mentioned, it's also the activity that's most challenging and it's a little abstract. So most people are just like, the hell with that. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to do like impact effort and figure it out and plot it all out. So the Cynefin is a good precursor to doing something like a weighting activity, like impact effort or an NUF or something like that. Let me see if I can get one more in. These are awesome. Go one more from Dan. Let's see. I'm just going to read it silently for a second and see which one. Let's see. Let's talk about this one, Dan. So this question is, any tips on framing the sailboat or harbor? Right. So these are perfect. So these are activities that are in the problem framing process that I use and part of the toolkit, which, by the way, in case anyone has to hop, there are links to the toolkit down here. There's some other resources down here that you can go through. This is a video series. This is a video series. This is a mini course on facilitation.
Hey,
yeah.
Jay.
Yes.
First of all, thank you for doing this, and thank you for answering all my emails. I really appreciate it. A little bit of context on that. So I'm using this more for sort of at the exec level with the executive team and sort of what problems they really should be focused on. The reason being is because there's over several conversations, there's obvious misalignment, and the misalignment is around do we need to do something about our pricing? Pricing is an interesting thing because it sort of touches everything. So it's like, oh, well, there's some friction between sales and renewals or sales and expansion, or there's some friction with new product development. And so there's a lot of confusion around, hey, should we touch pricing, but no one's sort of up leveling that to what's the sort of high level business or customer problems we're actually trying to solve. So my question here is really, I don't want to frame the rest of the exercise that assumes the answer is we have pricing problems to fix, when the question is really, what are the kind of core problems that the business is facing? And towards at the end of this, do any of these imply that we change, they change the pricing? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's definitely a meaty topic because, right, like the connection to pricing is value, of course. So like if you're questioning value, you could potentially be questioning like the mission of the company itself. So it's, boiling the ocean. It's
boiling
not-
the ocean with the sailboat. You end up on the couch.
I like it. For context, the sailboat activity is where I start framing, and it's the way that I call it problem surfacing. So like allowing the team to visualize and sort of capture all of the different problems, or in Taylor's case, all the opportunities that the group may want to solve for, or at least continue this workshop, continue this conversation talking about. And so like all the problems, then you do something like the Cynefin and the impact effort, and eventually you get to the part in the conversation where the team is like, this thing here. And so if it's around pricing, number one, my first question, of course, is why does the customer care? If like, do they care that they're paying too much? Yeah, yes, but if there's value associated to the product or service or the offering, then they probably don't care. So it feels like, man, it could go either way. And I also, just as a quick aside, I have a friend who did a whole pricing strategy for a biotech company that she works at. I had no idea if she has the time or willingness or legal authority to talk with you, but I've lost touch in the work that she was doing there. I was going to help her with some research. So if I can, I'll connect you with her. Maybe she has better, more specific insights.
Yeah, maybe the high level question is, how do you usually frame the harbor conversation?
Okay. Okay. That's an easier question. So it's around, first, I talk with people one-on-one beforehand, because what I'm trying to pull out of them are like, what should we talk about? And probably more importantly, what should we not talk about? So what would be a waste of time? What are other groups already working on? What's within the domain of you, senior leader, and this group of people, so that we don't so that somebody doesn't swoop in and kill all the ideas that come out of it. So I'm trying to get like the guardrails, so that, and that's where that sort of like harbor comes in, as you mentioned here. That's where then I can share back with the group. So when I talk to these few folks and all of you beforehand, it sounds like where we're going with this conversation is over here. And so what I'm trying to do is, when I invite them then to share potential problems to be solved, that it's not a complete apples and oranges conversation, because that becomes very difficult to map together and to find themes of what's interesting. And this conversation that you and I are having right now is difficult, because without a specific context of it, and without me being able to dig into it, it's hard for me to say these are kind of the guardrails around pricing that I'd be asking them for. Is this helpful so far? Or is there any, do you want to dig into anything else I've said?
No, I think I don't want to take up all the time, so that's good. Thank you.
Yeah. I'd like to actually come back and maybe we could talk about it over email.
Sure.
We're at 1:30. Let me try to answer one more. That one didn't land as well for me as I wanted it to. If you have to hop, that's totally fine. I think the calendar invite was still for an hour. So I'm going to answer one more by Kristine's. And then just as another heads up, if you can, there's links to the next AMA I'm doing, which is the design sprint one on Monday, November 8th. That one says 1 to 1:30. And then the next problem framing AMA will be posted here. So after this, I'm going to record, I'll organize all the answers from today's session. And then the next problem framing AMA will be here. Dan, Kristine, any questions that you didn't answer, I'll go through and I'll answer them. If you're here, if you're not here, I'll get to them, I'll answer them, and then they'll be posted over here, and you'll see an answer with a little pink post-it next to it. That means that the question has been answered. And this mural stays around forever, so you can come back whenever you'd like. Let me try to get one more in. What do you ask the team to bring to a problem framing workshop? What can they do to prepare? So kind of similar to what we talked about. So what do they know about the problem space? Is it new? Is it totally new space? Is it existing space? If it's a new space, who else should we be talking to? So people outside the company, why this space? are there any competitors or something that we should do some kind of like benchmarking against? If it's a new space, then chances are the group is going to be bringing more assumption to it. So then in that case, I may ask, can we go and talk to some potential customers first so that at least we have a little bit of a foundation to have a conversation around? We could get the group together and talk about it. It'll be fairly assumptive. And then we would have to go and fact check a lot of that with research, which can feel like a little bit of like 2 steps forward, 1 step back. So if I can do any sort of research in the domain beforehand or work with the like a UX or a research function and bring that to the conversation, then that gives a good kickoff to that conversation. If it's an existing product or service or offering, then they should have personas or journey maps or things like that. So I'll organize those artifacts and go through it myself, go through it in one-on-ones with a UX person just to understand what the existing thing looks like. And then that serves as a good entryway into like the Sailboat, which is like, where in this experience are we trying to solve for? And what's the customer problem? What kind of research have you done? What can we bring, so that the team is level set? Because if it's truly cross-functional, there should be some folks from like business or sales or marketing or something, and they probably don't spend much of their days looking at journey maps and personas. So the more we can bring that stuff to the conversation, the better.
Great. And, actually slight follow on to that, just because you've mentioned it a few times today. You've mentioned meeting people one-on-one beforehand. Are you meeting with all of the participants ahead of time, or are you just meeting with major stakeholders? Who are you talking to beforehand?
I prioritize senior leadership. Well, in this order: senior folks who are directly impacted by the conversations that we have and that cannot be part of the sessions. So those are the folks I talk to first. Then senior folks who will be impacted but will be there. Then other like key decision makers and people that would be part of any sort of discovery session, or researchers, or people that like can articulate what the team knows so far about the space. So I kind of like work down. I try to talk to everyone that would be part of at least like the discovery work. And discovery is sort of just my umbrella that I use to capture research and framing and sort of like some visioning there. So anyone that would be part of that, I do try to talk to all of those people individually, if possible. 30 minutes, and highly structured, and I do it and I'm like showing them the mural or mural boards as I'm capturing. So it's like super transparent conversation.
Awesome. Thank you.
Cool. Okay. So that's it. How is this format? Did it feel, normally I'm like very slow and deliberate and I tell stories and.
I feel like it puts a ton, I reminded that this is being recorded. I was going to say, puts a big ton of pressure on you to respond very quickly. So
yeah, and I said I was going to have the chat in front of me, and then I lost it and forgot to put it back. I don't know what your first name is. Pierce, can you spell the acronym? Was that about Cynefin?
Yes, and the person put it in there. Thank you.
Rashid,
and I do like the format only because I'm pretty stressed for time, like everybody. So
yeah, right.
A lot to learn, but it's great. Thank you.
Cool. Okay, glad this was helpful. Thank you all for being here and spending 5 extra minutes. Hopefully I see you in the next AMA coming up. And don't forget to check the links down in the bottom of the board. There's some good stuff in there for you to dig into framing some more.
Thank you.
Thanks, y'all. Have a great week.